One kid killing the parents is a bad seed. Two kids killing the parents is a bad family.
And at some point, did you leave his office and take a walk with him?
Yes, at some point I asked him to go for a walk.
Now, was that planned in advance?
No.
And had you thought about doing that before you got to his office?
No.
What prompted you to want to take a walk?
Just that I was having trouble telling him about why I was suicidal, since I hadn't told him that I killed my parents, and so he wasn't really getting it, and so I just decided that I needed to tell somebody, and I decided to tell him right then.
Had you decided to tell him before you went to his office?
No.
And so it was while you were trying to explain why you were suicidal that you decided you should tell him?
Yes.
What did you think? Did you think it would help in some way if you told him?
It would help. It would help in some ways, I guess. I really wasn't thinking that clearly. I really wanted him at that point to tell me that I wasn't a bad person and tell me that I wasn't this horrible, terrible person that I was thinking that I was. And he couldn't do that unless he knew that I killed my parents.
Okay.
So
you left to go on the walk?
Yes.
And during the course of that walk, were you considering telling him?
Yes, I was considering telling him.
Why didn't you just tell him right away?
It was too difficult a thing to just tell him. I was afraid to just tell him.
And how long did it take for you to get over being afraid before you told him?
Between a half hour and an hour, I'm not sure.
And do you remember what he said, generally, after you did tell him?
Yes.
And what did he say?
He said that I thought I was going to tell him and that I had no choice but to tell him.
I don't understand. He said you thought?
No, he said that he thought I was going to tell him this, and that he had suspected this, and that I had no choice but to tell him.
Okay. And did he say anything else about your having told him?
He said that I had no choice, and that it was something that I couldn't hold inside of me forever.
And do you know why he was saying those things to you at that time? Had you said anything about...
I was just telling him how guilty I felt and how I was having trouble with all of my relatives and them not knowing, and how I couldn't have any type of a relationship with anybody. I was just having difficulty.
Okay. Did you regret telling him the minute you did or not?
No.
Okay. Now, after you told him, did you go back to his office?
Yeah, I started talking to him on the way up about now what I was really feeling suicidal about, and I started going into my dreams and really explaining why I was so depressed.
Okay. And so basically you had a new talk about suicide and depression.
We had a new talk, but a more in-depth talk, I guess, or at least I filled him more in why.
Okay. Now, at some point, did Dr. Oziel start to question you about the shooting of your parents?
Yes.
Now, when you were deciding to tell him, you said your purpose was so you could better explain why you were suicidal?
Yes.
While you were deciding to tell him on that walk, had you made up your mind about whether you would tell him the details or anything like that?
No, I really wasn't thinking. I was thinking one step at a time. I wasn't really thinking in advance. I just told him on an instinct that maybe this would be a good idea, and I really wasn't thinking of the consequences, or I wasn't thinking of Lyle. I was just pretty miserable, and so I just decided to tell him.
All right, but were you thinking of telling him the details of the shooting before you told him that you had done it?
No.
So when he started questioning you about the details, was that something that you had prepared to answer?
No.
When he was questioning you about the details, did you tell him some of the details?
Yeah, he asked me how Lyle and I shot our parents.
And did you tell him how?
Yeah.
And did he ask you anything else?
Yeah, he wanted to know what happened after that, and I just basically told him what happened after that.
You told him about what happened that night after that? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
So let's not lead the witness. Ask him what he said.
What do you mean by you told him what happened after that?
I told him that Lyle and I had walked into the room with 2 shotguns and killed our parents, and
Okay.
that's why I felt so guilty. And I told him about what happened before we went to the police, that we had dropped off the guns, that we had been at the theater. We just told him different things.
My question was, what did you mean by you told him what happened after that? After meaning when?
After my parents died.
Yes, I know, Mr. Menendez, but that night, the next night, that week, that month? What do you mean?
That night.
Okay. And do you remember, did he seem interested in these details?
Yeah, he seemed very interested in the details. He cut me off when I was talking about my depression and my suicide. He said, "Well, let me just hear what happened," and so I told him what happened.
And did he ask you questions when you were telling him what happened? Informational questions to
Yeah,
learn?
he was asking a lot of questions.
And after you told him these details, what happened next?
He was still asking a lot of questions. He asked about the guns. He asked about
What did he ask you?
Mulholland Highway.
What did he ask you about the guns?
He asked me, where did we get these guns? He asked me if we had them in the house, where we got them.
And so did you tell him about purchasing the guns?
I told him that we bought them in San Diego.
And do you recall anything else that he asked you at that point, after you had told him the details of that night and told him about buying the guns?
Anything else more than what he had asked me about the details?
Yeah. What did he, do you recall if he asked you anything after you told him?
Yeah, he asked me why it happened.
Did he ask you at any time who knew about it?
Yes.
And when in the sequence did he ask you that?
I think right after. Because I had been talking about the fact that the guns were on Mulholland, and that he asked me why the police hadn't arrested us already if Lyle and I personally bought the guns, and so I told him about what I thought the police knew and who knew what and what the situation was.
And did you tell him that before he asked you why?
Yes, I think so.
Was there a discussion about Lyle and Lyle knowing that you were there?
Yes.
And when did that come up?
That may have even come up before I told him about what I thought the police knew. That may have come up even in the middle of me telling him the details of what happened that night.
Well, how did it come up?
He asked me if Lyle knew I was here. And I said no, Lyle didn't know I was here, and I wasn't sure how I was going to tell Lyle that I told him. Now that I did tell him. I hadn't thought about it, and so I hadn't thought about telling him. And so he said, well, how are you going to tell Lyle? And he just kept grilling me about what I was going to tell Lyle, how I was going to tell Lyle, when I was going to tell Lyle. And I said, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't. And he said, no, definitely you should.
Now, before he started grilling you about Lyle and when and how and why you should tell him, had it even crossed your mind in the recitation? You even thought about Lyle? And
No.
had it even occurred to you that you might want to tell him that you had told Dr. Oziel, or might not want to tell him?
No, as soon as I told him that Lyle and I did this, I didn't think about any of those things. I wasn't...
So would it be fair to say Dr. Oziel seemed concerned about Lyle?
Oh, yes.
Overall,
Yes, he wanted to... He didn't want me to just go and tell Lyle.
Well, had you even planned to do that?
I hadn't even thought about it. And as he was asking me, I was trying to think. And so I just said what the best I could think of what I might do.
Okay. So when this came up, when Dr. Oziel brought this up and after this discussion, did he decide to do something?
Yes, he wanted to call Lyle right away, and that's what he did. He got on the phone and called Lyle.
And, okay, and after he called Lyle, did he tell you something about Lyle?
He told me that Lyle was coming over.
Okay. And at that point, when he told you that Lyle was coming over, right after that, do you recall what the conversation was that you had with Dr. Oziel?
I said I don't remember exactly where in the conversation he called Lyle. I think he called him right as I was finished telling him the details, or right when I was telling him about what the police knew.
Well, which happened first, Mr. Menendez? Did you tell him about the details and then answer his questions about what did the police know?
Yes.
Okay. And
so it may have been that he called Lyle after all of that. I'm not exactly sure.
all right, did all of that come before his asking you why or after?
He first asked me about the details, and then he asked me why.
Did he first ask you what does the police know?
Yes.
Okay, so that did all come before he asked you why?
Yeah, I'm quite sure about that.
Now, when he asked you why, what was your reaction to that question?
I wasn't expecting that question.
Why not?
I don't know. I mean, I hadn't even thought about telling him. I hadn't thought about what I was going to say. And it just shook me that he asked me why. So I just told him what I told him.
Well, let me ask you this. At that point, when he asked you why, was it your understanding that your brother was on his way over?
Yes, I knew Lyle was on his way over.
And how long ordinarily would it have taken for someone to get from your house on Elm Drive to Dr. Oziel's office on Bedford Drive?
It ordinarily would have taken 5 minutes. He took a little longer. I started to stall and wait for him, but it just kept dragging on. He didn't come right away.
When Dr. Oziel asked you why, did you tell him?
No, I told him I didn't know.
And why did you tell him you didn't know?
Because I didn't know how to respond. He was very forceful. He was very aggressive, and he was very interested in all the details and everything about it. And that's not why I was there to talk to him.
Okay, you were there to try to what?
I was there to try to feel better and talk about how not to kill myself. And that's not what he wanted to talk about.
So when you told him you didn't know why, what did he start saying?
He asked me, I think he asked me when we started talking about it. He asked me something about when the idea came up, or when it first occurred to Lyle and I, or something like that.
Okay. And do you recall what you said to him?
Yeah.
And what did you say?
I said that Lyle and I had had conversations that week.
And that was true, wasn't it? You had had conversations that week with your brother.
Yes.
And did you tell him the nature of the conversations that you had with your brother that week?
I told him part of the nature of the conversations. I was just really playing it by ear, and I was just trying to go from one sentence to the next, not knowing what I was going to say.
Was there some reason why you didn't want to tell him the truth?
Yes.
What?
I absolutely was not wanting to tell him about the sex between Dad and I.
Why?
because I just didn't want to discuss it with him.
Did you want to discuss it with anybody?
No, I wanted to get it away. I was having a lot of flashbacks. I was having a lot of problems dealing with it even after, and I just didn't. I wanted to get away from it.
Now, during the conversations that you actually did have with your brother that week before the shooting, I think you've already told us there were conversations about how the family was not close and how you wanted to be close to Lyle. Is that right?
We had those conversations that week, but I didn't understand the question.
Okay. I was just asking you, did you have those conversations?
Yes.
And did you tell Dr. Oziel about that? That
yes.
You talked with your brother about the family not being close?
Yes, I told him about all of those things, about the family. A lot of the conversation that I had with Lyle on Tuesday.
Now let me ask you this, Mr. Menendez. Did Dr. Oziel know your parents?
Yes, he knew them very well.
To the best of your knowledge, had he met with them several times?
Yes.
And during the time that you were talking to him, was he expressing himself, or was he describing them to you?
Objection.
Rephrase the question.
I have to think.
All right. It's a very vague question.
Okay.
Ask
During the
something else.
time that you were talking to Dr. Oziel on October 31st, was he telling you his opinion of your parents' personalities?
Objection.
It's the same.
Was he talking about your parents?
Yes.
And in what way was he talking about your parents?
He was telling me about my father and why I probably did this. And
When you say he was telling you about your father, what kinds of things was he, I don't mean to quote him, but...
he was telling me that my father was an extraordinarily controlling person. I think he used the word dominating, and basically he was saying that Dad was pretty ferocious and aggressive, and he was saying that nobody could live under those circumstances, and that's probably why I had my confusion.
Did he seem to know your father in the way he described him?
Yes.
And was he putting together characteristics of him?
Yes, characteristics. You'd be right.
Now, when he would say...
More than characteristics. I would say he was putting together what he felt my dad was.
The kind of person he felt your
Yes.
dad was.
Objection.
Overruled.
And what was your response when he would say these things?
I would agree. At this point, I was waiting for Lyle to come, and I was just letting the conversation flow.
Now, you've heard Dr. Oziel in court, Mr. Menendez. Did he talk a great deal during this session of October 31st, or was he just quiet and listening?
No, Dr. Oziel tended to talk
In that session?
a lot in that session, and
What about in the next session on November 2nd? Did he tend to talk a lot in that session as well?
yeah, even more at that point. But I wanted him to talk. I wanted him to keep talking because at that point I had to think of reasons about why I was going to tell Lyle I told Dr. Oziel.
So you were somewhat distracted at that point?
Sustained.
What do you mean you had to think?
Not distracted. I was very concerned that Lyle was coming over. I wanted Lyle to come over, but I was also concerned that Lyle was coming over because I knew that I had really betrayed my brother's trust, and I was thinking about Lyle's going to be angry with me, and he had a right to be, and I just was thinking real quickly before I got there, because I thought he'd be there any minute, about what I was going to tell Lyle, and how I was going to explain to him that I told Dr. Oziel.
Okay. And did Lyle get there?
Yes.
All right, we're going to have to take a recess. I indicated that one of the jurors has to leave at 4:20, and we're almost there, so we'll take a recess until tomorrow.